Happy Thanksgiving week, Headliner Nation. We got 3 days to try to release 9 videos so you have everything you need to dominate in week 12 fantasy football. So do me a favor, grab a cup of coffee, give me a Ric Flair, woo, and let's dive into some week 12 quarterbacks. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today. We're talking about week 12 quarterbacks here for fantasy football. Now, Kyle, Taylor, myself, we're not going to get much sleep here to start the week. However, we hope you enjoy a great Thanksgiving week here in 2024. But don't forget, I got your back in multiple ways. I know some of you out there are about to be stressed the F out during some Thanksgiving get-togethers. Some of you out there may even have a few too many of those oh-so-delicious adult beverages to get yourself through those get-togethers. But we don't want you paying for it the next day. Remember, we found something here with 0 sugar, 0 caffeine, only 10 calories, and 3 times the electrolytes as its main competitor. It's something that's going to help rehydrate you, get rid of your nausea, calm your anxiety, and give you a boost of vitamins to knock out any fatigue. Especially those of you that are about to shop till you drop on Black Friday, you need to be sure to check out waterboy.com/headliners. They have multiple different flavors, something for everyone. And if you overindulge during the holidays, we don't want it to linger into next week. So be sure to head over to waterboy.com/headliners so you can get 15% off your order. It's nothing difficult to use either. It's 1 packet in 32 ounces of cold water. Give it a little shake and rehydrate immediately. Get on the road to rehydration right now. Waterboy.com/headliners for 15% off your order. There are links down below in the description. But now it's time we head into some football games. Typically, we have one on Thursday, but Thursday is Thanksgiving, and we got a trio of games on the slate kicking it off with the Green Bay Packers and Detroit Lions. And when it comes to Jordan Love, I kind of feel like he gets the Justin Fields treatment here in fantasy football. A lot of fantasy players out there see the play on the field, and it may not be great at times, but they lose track of. They totally forget that all that matters in fantasy football is fantasy points, and Jordan Love scores them weekly. Only 2 games all year long has he scored under 15 fantasy points in a game. He's actually scored more points this season than his opponent in this game, Jared Goff, which a lot of people would not really expect. He was great in week 11, kind of like we expected him to be against a poor Los Angeles Chargers defense, but he's also throwing the ball a lot more lately. Over 40 pass attempts now in 3 of his last 4 ball games, and a lot of that has to do with the run game being banged up. And once again, what do you know? Aaron Jones is hurt again, but now a matchup going up against Detroit. They allow 18.8 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is 4th most in the league. These 2 teams faced off back in week 4. In that game, Jordan Love had 246 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, but also had a rushing touchdown as well. In that game, scored 19.6 fantasy points. But like I just mentioned, Aaron Jones is once again banged up, and if I had to guess, no, I'm no doctor, but he's probably going to miss more time. I'm really honestly more concerned about the status of wide receiver Dontavian Wicks, and you may be thinking, what the hell is Dontavian Wicks? This kid has been playing great football over the last month or so of the season. He's currently in the concussion protocol and would love to have him out there this week for Jordan Love. Now, in no way can I look at Jordan Love and say this is some locked-in, smash, must-start guy, but honestly, I don't hate it this week. With the likes of Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, hopefully Dontavian Wicks, Christian Watson, Luke Musgrave, against a team that allows the type of points that the Lions do to opposing quarterbacks, I have a feeling Jordan Love is going to be right in that range of quarterback 11 to 15 for me this week in my rankings. But what about Jared Goff? He's coming off his first game with multiple interceptions since week 7 of last year. That's only happened 3 times over the last 3 seasons, so am I overly worried about it? No, not really, because Jared Goff just continues to go out there and basically be a low-end quarterback 1 each and every week. This running game, though, is taking away a lot of touchdowns. Now, while that's great for the Lions, it's not so great for Jared Goff. But it's not like the touchdowns have just disappeared for him in Detroit. He still has 4 passing touchdowns over the last 2 weeks of the season. He's averaging right around 18 fantasy points per game, and he's thrown for at least 2 touchdowns in each of the last 2 Thanksgiving games. That has to play a part, right? But now he gets a matchup going up against Green Bay. And on the surface, this is a very difficult matchup because they only allow 14.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is 9th fewest in the league. But don't let those numbers fool you. The Green Bay defense right now is completely banged up, and 2 of their last 3 games have been against the likes of Brett Rypien and Kenny Pickett. I would venture to say that Brett Rypien and Kenny Pickett didn't do much to boost that overall number. But on top of all of that, it's a home game for Jared Goff, and he has multiple touchdowns in all but 1 game at home this season, coming off an emotional high, a comeback victory there in Week 11, at home on Thanksgiving against a hurt Green Bay defense. I look at Jared Goff pretty similar to how I look at Jordan Love here this week, 2 quarterbacks that are both going to be right there in that 11 to 15 range in my rankings. Which will then take us to Thanksgiving game number 2. By this time, you've got your plate of food, you've sat down, and you're just hammering it at this point, and you're probably watching a matchup between the Washington Commandos and the Dallas Cowboys. Now, for Sam Howell, every single week it feels kind of weird to rank him inside the top 12, but then every single week finishes and he finds himself inside the top 12. Now, last week, it wasn't really pretty, right? One of his top 3 worst games of the season, I probably can say that. He just struggles for whatever reason against the New York Football Giants, but he was saved in Week 11 by his 2nd rushing touchdown of the season. A lot of people forget about that potential rushing upside that we have from Sam Howell. Just because he's not running a lot each week doesn't mean he isn't capable. This is a guy that ran for over 800 yards in college in 1 year. He just has to throw the ball so much in Washington. That defense is horrendous. Over 42 pass attempts now in 5 straight games. That's what you would call a trend here in the NFL. Now, it's not going to stop anytime soon, which is good because as of right now, Sam Howell is the quarterback 4 overall in fantasy football. A matchup this week, though, going up against Dallas, isn't really ideal. They allow only 14.6 fantasy points per game, 10th fewest to opposing quarterbacks, but they've had some cream puff, stat padding type matchups here as of late as well. Bryce Young, Tommy DeVito, and half of a game of Brett Rypien, they definitely help bring that average down just a little bit. When it comes to injuries, it's Antonio Gibson. He missed the game in Week 11 and has a potential to miss it once again here in Week 12. Going on the road to play Dallas on Thanksgiving is going to be a tall task to ask Sam Howell to have a top 12 week. Nothing here screams, you must start Sam Howell this week, but his play this year cannot be ignored. He's going to be a low-end QB1, high-end quarterback 2 in a very difficult matchup. For his opponent, though, Dak Prescott is about as hot as it gets in fantasy football right now. Another great game from Dak in Week 11, in a game in which he really didn't have to do very much, though, to beat Carolina, right? 189 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. But like I said, has to be one of the hottest playing quarterbacks right now in the NFL. He has 14 total touchdowns over his last 4 games played. He's already averaging 20 fantasy points per game and is all the way up to quarterback 6 on the season. This team, listen to this is crazy. The Dallas Cowboys have outscored their opponents by a total of 127 points this season. Just for reference, the New York Giants have only scored 149 points all year long. Dallas has been dominant most of the season. Now they get a matchup going up against Washington, one of the worst defenses in the NFL, a defense that just made Tommy DeVito look good last week. Washington allows over 21 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is the most in the NFL. Dak has scored over 24 fantasy points now, 4 of the last 5 games he's played. It's a crazy hot streak. The team is playing good. The overall offense is producing. Thanksgiving game at home in Dallas, and he gets the best matchup of the week. Dak's probably going to be up inside my top 5 quarterbacks for the week this week. which will then take us to our final game of the triple header on Thanksgiving. By this time, you've fallen into a full-fledged food coma and you're barely paying attention to the San Francisco 49ers and Seattle Seahawks. Now, for San Francisco, we said a few weeks ago that when this entire San Francisco offense is healthy, it's hard to not have all those main pieces in your lineup. And once again, Brock Purdy showed you why back in week 11. He completed over 80% of his passes, threw for over 300 yards, and had his second straight game with 3 passing touchdowns. When Brock Purdy has time in the pocket, he will pick the opposing team apart, just like he has the last 2 weeks. Defenses can't stop a fully healthy Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle. You bring defenders up to try to slow down Christian McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel, no big deal. They'll go over the top to George Kittle and Brandon Ayuk. Take a few guys out of the box. Good luck trying to contain Christian McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel. It's really one of those situations that no matter how you attack them, they have a way to counter it. Now they have a matchup going up against Seattle. They allow 16.9 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, right around league average. My biggest concern here, if I'm being honest, around Brock Purdy, it's how well does Geno Smith play? Because he's not 100% healthy. And if for whatever reason we see Drew Lock in this matchup playing for Seattle, Purdy may end up getting some rest late in that game. Hopefully he scores enough points early where it's not an issue, and hopefully Geno Smith is good to go here in week 12. It's really too hard to sit Brock Purdy. As for Geno Smith, does he really play this week? If he does, how limited, if at all, is he? He suffered an elbow injury back in week 11. He missed a chunk of that game. However, came back into the game late in the fourth quarter to try to lead a fourth quarter comeback. It did not happen. He came up just short. But even if he does play in this ball game, can he withstand the punishment of the San Francisco 49ers pass rush with Nick Bosa and Chase Young? This defense only allows 13.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is 4th fewest in the league. Now, Pete Carroll has already come out and said that he expects Geno Smith to suit up for this game this week. But you got to think, with this being a short week, a late night Thanksgiving Day game, this is not ideal. Things are not lining up great for Geno Smith. Over the last 6 weeks of the season, he's averaged only 14 fantasy points per game, which is right around what San Francisco allows. Add in any limitations due to the injury or maybe even the risk of further injuring himself, and we're looking at Geno as more of a top 15 to 20 option and not a top 12 option here in week 12. But just because we've made it through the Thanksgiving Day games doesn't mean we get to head into Sunday football. No, we have a game on Friday this week, Friday afternoon, between the Miami Dolphins and New York Jets. Now for Miami, we saw Tua with a solid bounce back in week 11, 325 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, and that was against a pretty solid overall Raiders defense. But some may look forward to this game against the Jets and get a little bit worried with the potential matchup. Honestly, though, I don't feel that way. This is a divisional game that the Dolphins absolutely need to win. Plus, this Jets team overall just looks defeated, and now even the defense is looking sloppy at times. Are they really going to rally around Tim Boyle because he's going to lead them to the promised land? No freaking way. They have no confidence heading into this ball game. The Jets right now allow 15.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but 2 of the last 3 weeks, they faced Tommy DeVito and Aiden O'Connell. Now, it's still unclear whether or not we're going to have Devon Achane back this week. Did they bring him back too early? Potentially. Now, from a fantasy perspective, that absolutely sucks because so many people were waiting for his return, but it could also lead to more throwing here in the near future for Tua. Now, Tua missed both games in 2022 against the Jets, so we really don't have any history to go off here, but he's got too many weapons at his disposal against an inferior opponent to not want to start him once again in week 12. He's more than likely going to be a top 12 option for me once again this week. Now, as for his opponent, Tim Boyle, absolutely freaking not. There is nobody out there right now saying, it's week 12, trying to make a run at the fantasy playoffs. Maybe I should consider Tim Boyle. Ain't nobody out there saying that. One of the worst offenses in the NFL. No teams on a bye this week. It's just not going to happen. We're not considering him here this week. But now, finally, we can go to some Sunday football, starting off with the New Orleans Saints and Atlanta Falcons. And for New Orleans, the last time we saw this Saints team on the field in week 10, it was Jameis Winston at quarterback, and he was just slinging that rock down the field to Chris Olave after Derek Carr suffered an injury. Now, they're saying that the shoulder injury that Carr suffered, he should be okay. However, at the time of this recording, he's still in the concussion protocol, so we really don't know for sure. Does anyone else out there maybe want Jameis Winston to start? I mean, all of us who own Chris Olave, I think we kind of do, right? But let's just take a look at this in case we may have a Jameis Winston start this week. Let's look at both guys. So when you look at Derek Carr, he's a little bit more of a mid to low end quarterback too. Most weeks, he's going to score you right around 15 to 16 fantasy points. He's not going to kill you. He's not going to win you a week by himself. Now, Jameis Winston only played in a half a game back in week 10 and scored 10 fantasy points. Now, sure, it was somewhat garbage time. They were trailing. He was having to throw the ball a lot, but he was definitely throwing the ball down the field much more consistently than Derek Carr. Now they get a matchup going up against Atlanta. They allow 17.6 fantasy points per game, which is 13th most in the league, but most importantly, I guess this is somewhat importantly, Michael Thomas is doubtful to play. With Michael Thomas doubtful, you better believe that New Orleans, if they want to have any chance at winning, no matter who the quarterback is, they're going to have to throw the ball down the field more. So if there was ever a time to force feed Chris Olave, this may be it. So which one of these guys do we really want to start for New Orleans from a fantasy football perspective? Honestly, Derek Carr is still probably the safer option in this offense. He's going to be that guy that gets you that 15, 16 fantasy points. We know that. We also saw Jameis Winston throw 2 interceptions in a half of football, and a lot of people have kind of PTSD when it comes to Jameis Winston throwing interceptions. Now, on the flip side of that, I do believe that if we have a Jameis Winston start, the potential ceiling is going to be higher than that of Derek Carr. Where I really see that ceiling of Jameis Winston right around quarterback 14 to 16 or so, and Derek Carr more so in that 16 to 20 range. Even though this matchup isn't bad, neither one of these guys are ones that I'm chomping at the bit to start in fantasy football each week, along with their opponent, right? It's Desmond Ridder. He's back as the starter once again in Atlanta, and Arthur Smith's coaching skills are on full display right now in Atlanta. Show confidence in the young quarterback early in the season, then completely kill his confidence and bench him, and then lose every game with the guy you benched him for. Now all of a sudden, the backup is injured in Taylor Heineke, so we're going back to Desmond Ridder, and we fully believe in him. Shut up. This dude, how does this dude have a coaching job in the NFL? Absolutely mind-blowing, but the facts are this when we're talking about Desmond Ridder. He has 6 passing touchdowns total through 8 starts this season. He's averaging under 13 fantasy points per game. He's 4 rushing touchdowns away from being quarterback 30 overall on the season. Only one time all year long has he had back-to-back good games, and he could be without another weapon in this passing game in Mac Hollins once again this week, who's dealing with an ankle injury. I mean, come on. Let's be realistic here. His own team doesn't have confidence in him. Why should I have confidence in starting him on my fantasy football team? Not in this offense. It's not like this is some high-powered offense that we got to have a piece of. Not in Atlanta, not interested in Desmond Ridder. Which will then take us over to Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. We'll kick it off with Kenny Pickett because I'm not interested here either, but I did see a pretty interesting stat around Kenny Pickett here earlier in the week. Over the last 2 seasons, Matt Ryan, Davis Mills, and Marcus Mariota all have more passing touchdowns than Kenny Pickett. Here's the kicker, though. Those 3 have a combined 1 pass attempt all year long. He only has 1 total touchdown over the last month of the season. Hasn't thrown for over 200 yards in a game in the last month of the season. Teams are out there absolutely lighting up the defenses of the Jacksonville Jaguars and Tennessee Titans almost weekly. Yet Pickett, combined against those 2 teams, had 233 yards and 1 touchdown in both of those games combined. Now a matchup going up against Cincinnati, it's not a bad one. They allow over 18.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 7th most in the league. Most of the injuries on this Pittsburgh team are on defense, not worried about it on offense, but I'm really trying to find some positives here because this is one of those matchups that you typically want to start an opposing quarterback against, but this dude's lack of production is an absolute killer. But I'll end it with this. Bryce Young, who's actually missed 1 more game this year than Kenny Pickett, still has more fantasy points than he does, and ain't nobody out there considering starting Bryce Young in fantasy football. How about his opponent? It's not Joe Burrow, and that makes me sad on the inside. It's rookie quarterback Jake Browning, and I think we can all agree that he's not really a fantasy viable option here just yet. The dude needs to turn into like 2022 Brock Purdy to have a chance in fantasy football here in 2023. We know he has the weapons, right? Even if he doesn't have T. Higgins, he still has Jamar Chase and Tyler Boyd and Irv Smith and Tanner Hudson and Joe Mixon. We just need to see what this kid can do when he's given a full week to prep to be the #1 quarterback here in this offense. A matchup going up against Pittsburgh, they allow 14.9 fantasy points per game, but like I said, we're still waiting to find out about T. Higgins. If I had to guess, there's no reason to rush him back at this point, dealing with that hamstring injury. I'm really pulling for this kid. I would love to see him do good things, but on the other hand, that's probably my selfishness on the inside that really wants Jamar Chase to still be a thing the remainder of 2023. Which takes us out to Houston for the Texans and the Jags, and for Trevor Lawrence, there he is. Been looking for that little guy all over the place here in 2023. Found him in week 11. It was by far his best game of the season. 262 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, and added in 2 Russian tutties on the ground. That's what I'm talking about. T-Law against Tennessee last week. It's really crazy, right? Look what this offense looks like when you give Calvin Ridley targets. Super crazy, huh? Let's just hope that that was really what that offense needed to jumpstart things going forward, and we can make a late season run. Because we already know it was never about talent. It was always just about the opportunity in this offense. And there aren't going to be very many teams in the NFL that each and every week can shut down the likes of Travis Etienne, Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, and Evan Ingram. But now they get a matchup going up against Houston. They allow 17.9 fantasy points per game, 11th most in the league. Now back in week 3, these two teams faced off against each other. In that game, Trevor Lawrence, 279 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and Houston got the win 37-17. Now, if Trevor Lawrence could just be more of a threat on the ground with his own legs each and every week, I think that takes this offense to the next level. We just saw Kyler Murray find that rushing success on the ground against this Houston team last week. We need Trevor Lawrence to do it here this week. Not an overall horrible start for Trevor Lawrence. He's probably going to be in that neighborhood of quarterback 11 to 15 or so in my rankings. His opponent going to be a whole lot higher. It's CJ Stroud, and he just keeps dealing week in and week out. 3 straight games over 330 yards passing, 9 total touchdowns over the last 3 games played, and the Texans have won all 3 of those ball games. Now, while this game won't be easy to win against Jacksonville, there's another huge opportunity for CJ Stroud to put up a big number in week 12. He's averaging over 19.6 fantasy points per game. He's the overall quarterback 8 in fantasy football, and he hasn't scored less than 18 fantasy points in a game since Halloween. Now, the turnovers, they have started here over the last couple weeks, and they aren't great. However, with the amount of offense that he puts up weekly, those turnover numbers aren't killing his fantasy production. Now a matchup going up against Jacksonville. They allow 18.2 fantasy points per game, 9th most in the NFL. Back in week 3, CJ Stroud had 280 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. We're still waiting to find out whether or not Noah Brown will return from injury this week. Did not have him last week, did not really seem to matter. I have no issues throwing CJ Stroud back in my lineup once again here in week 12 in a great matchup. Even without all of his top weapons at his disposal, he showed last week that he could put up big numbers still. Really similar to Ridley in Jacksonville. It's crazy what kind of offense you can get from Tank Dell when you actually give him double-digit targets a week. They didn't do that to start the year. That's why he was really hit or miss. Once they actually start giving that kid consistent volume each and every week, we're seeing exactly what he can do with it. Which will now bring us to Tampa Bay and Indianapolis. We'll kick it off with Baker Mayfield. And it may not be translating every single week into the box score, but personally, I am super impressed with the overall play of Baker Mayfield so far here in 2023. Now, he may never live up to that hype of going #1 overall. I get that. But with what we've seen this season in Tampa Bay, he has proven that he can be a solid starting quarterback in the NFL. Now, coming into week 11, he had 3 straight games with multiple touchdown passes. But we knew week 11 against San Francisco was not going to be an easy matchup. His own team's passing defense just doesn't do him any favors each and every week. He's constantly having to play catch up and go into gunslinger mode way too often. Now a matchup going up against Indianapolis. They allow 14.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's 8th fewest in the league. But their last few matchups have been Mac Jones, Bryce Young, and PJ Walker. That doesn't scream a whole lot of points right there. Now, when we're talking about injuries, most of them on the defensive side of the football. This Tampa Bay defense right now is definitely hurting. When it comes to Baker, though, this guy has scored at least 17 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games played. Is he some stud top 12 quarterback in fantasy football? No. But with the ground game in Tampa Bay being what it is, which is not great, they have to throw the ball a ton. Even if that means checkdowns to the running back in Rachaad White, it really makes the floor safer each and every week for Baker Mayfield. Now, once again, he may not make it into my top 12 overall on the week, but he's definitely a high-end quarterback to play for everyone out there that plays Superflex and 2 quarterback leagues. Now, for his opponent, we got Gardner Minshew, who's coming fresh off the bye week into a decent matchup going up against Tampa Bay. We just mentioned how this Tampa Bay defense is absolutely shredded on defense, and that can only help Gardner Minshew, right? Plus, with the bye week happening when it did, it had to give rookie wide receiver Josh Downs an opportunity to get healthy. Now, if there was ever a concern here really for Gardner Minshew, though, it's ever since we've seen Jonathan Taylor return to this running offense and be 100% healthy, the numbers have absolutely dipped for Gardner Minshew. And it's not like he was absolutely killing it to begin with, but now he's not having to throw the ball as much. They're just throwing overall a lot less due to the success they're finding on the ground with Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss. But like I said, this matchup is great. Tampa Bay allows 20 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is 3rd most in the NFL, and they are much easier to throw on than they are to run on. Now, for Gardner Minshew, he only has 2 games all season long where he's scored over 15 fantasy points, and he hasn't even hit double-digit fantasy points in his last 2 starts. Even though this matchup on paper is great, there is still going to be a lot of risk in starting Gardner Minshew here this week. In my opinion, more of a mid-quarterback 2 at best. Which will then take us down to New York for a battle of the Giants and the Patriots, or as I like to refer to it, a battle of 2 quarterbacks ain't nobody give a damn about in fantasy football, Mac Jones and Tommy DeVito. For Mac Jones, there's reports coming out that he's lost the locker room. There's reports coming out that he's lost his job. He's already been benched multiple times in-game this season, and he hasn't scored over 14 fantasy points in a game since week 2. I shouldn't have to talk you into not starting Mac Jones this week. But what about Tommy DeVito? He had a huge game in week 11. He totally proved me wrong. But I'm pretty sure that has more to say about how bad the Washington defense is instead of how good Tommy DeVito is. Regardless, though, I labeled him as a no way in hell chance of a guy I would start in fantasy football. He went out, threw 246 yards, 3 touchdowns, and I was proven wrong. But you know what? I'm willing to say it again. Ain't nobody out there starting Tommy DeVito against New England. This New England defense is way better than what he faced last week in Washington, and if he happens to go off again, then so be it. I'll be wrong again because I'm not buying it. I'm sorry, but in a week with no bye weeks, I'm not considering Tommy DeVito. Which will then take us down to Tennessee for the Titans and Panthers. In this matchup, this one isn't much better than the last one. A battle of 2 rookie quarterbacks, but more so, a battle between 2 guys just trying to score 12 or 13 fantasy points a week. Bryce Young has a total of 9 touchdowns on the season, and 3 of those came in 1 game back in week 5. He's got limited weapons. He's constantly under pressure and getting sacked. Now it's getting to the point where he's almost going backwards, because the last 2 games he's played in, he's barely completing even 55% of his passes. But man, this matchup is pretty good, but there is just no way you can trust this horrible offense and a struggling quarterback. Tennessee does allow right around 17 fantasy points per game, but no one is looking for a quarterback that can average only 12 fantasy points per contest. What about Will Levis? It was good to see Will Levis find the end zone once again back in week 11. He'd gone the previous 2 games without a touchdown at all. The bad part was he only threw the ball 17 times in a game that they were getting trounced in. In fact, this total offense only had 40 total snaps. Just for a little bit of comparison, Bryce Young last week in a blowout game against Dallas, their offense had 59 snaps, almost 20 more. Then we add in the turnovers here for Will Levis, and we got another guy that's scoring right around 12 fantasy points a week, only 12.5 in week 11. That's not much different than the high single digits that he had in weeks 9 and weeks 10. But now he gets a matchup going up against Carolina, and they're actually pretty good against opposing quarterbacks, allowing only 13.9 fantasy points per game, 6th fewest in the league. This offensive line in Tennessee is still an absolute mess. And ever since the first start here for Will Levis, we've yet to see that same flash again. No surprise though, because he's in an offense with limited high-end weapons and options. It's just going to lower his overall ceiling each and every week and really make him not fantasy startable. But now we head down to the desert for the Arizona Cardinals and Los Angeles Rams, and I have a new nickname for Matthew Stafford. From here on out, we're calling him Timex, because dude just takes a licking and keeps on ticking. Now, from a grown-ass man standpoint, respect. From a fantasy standpoint, not overly interested still in Matthew Stafford. He continues to just be in a low-scoring offense there in LA. Only one game all year long with multiple touchdowns. No finishes all year long inside the top 12 at the position, and now Cooper Kupp is dealing with a low ankle sprain. Arizona does allow 18.6 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is great, but we saw these two in a matchup a couple weeks ago. Matthew Stafford had his usual 226 yards passing, 1 touchdown. But we should be getting back Kyren Williams this week, and they could definitely rely on the running game a little bit more in this one. So many teams just find success on the ground against Arizona that they don't have to throw the ball a ton. While I don't hate Matthew Stafford here this week, I just view him as more of a mid to low end quarterback too once again this week. Now for his opponent, Kyler Murray, he seems to kind of pick up where he left off last year as being a solid fantasy option every game that he's healthy. Now, it may not always be pretty on the field. They may lose a lot of games, but dude scores a lot of fantasy points. At least 18 of them now in his first 2 games of the season here this year. Plus, he's had at least 30 yards rushing and a rushing touchdown in each of his 2 games. Interesting stat here, though, for Kyler Murray. In his last couple of matchups going up against the Los Angeles Rams, he has had over 300 yards passing in each game. However, no passing touchdowns, no rushing touchdowns against them since week 4 of 2021. But we know from 2021 to now, this is not the same LA Rams defense. We already know that. Right now, the Rams are allowing 17.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and we could be getting back rookie wide receiver Michael Wilson this week. He did not play in week 11. Kyler could definitely use him here in week 12. Now, while his passing numbers haven't been great since he's returned so far this year, you have to absolutely love the fact that he still has that instinct to tuck the ball and run when he's under pressure. He's not shying away from his mobility at all coming off the torn ACL, which is a great sign, and that alone is enough to have him back in your fantasy lineups just due to the rushing upside each and every week. The passing game, that will come in time, but for right now, Kyler, still a Verge top 12 guy weekly. Which will then take us up to Denver for the Broncos and the Cleveland Browns. We'll kick it off in Cleveland with DTR, who right now is DT. Not going to finish that. Kyle did it on the live show. I don't want to get canceled on the internet, but look out, just in case you were worried about the production of DTR, the Browns have signed Joe Flacco. I love how RG3 went out there and made a beautiful pitch just to get a chance in Cleveland, and then they go out and sign Joe Flacco. Now, I do expect DTR to get another start here this week. Flacco was only signed to the practice squad. And DTR did just lead them to a victory against the Pittsburgh Steelers, but from a fantasy standpoint, didn't really do much. 165 yards passing, 20 yards rushing, but no touchdowns, and did have 1 interception. Now, early in the year, we would welcome this matchup going up against the Denver Broncos, but this is not the same Denver team that we saw to start the season. Now, it still shows that Denver allows 18.7 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is great. I would love to have a starting quarterback each and every week score 18.7 fantasy points, but they've been playing better here as of late, and the numbers haven't had a chance to catch back up yet. In fact, listen to this. Since week 6, they've allowed on average 15.3 fantasy points per contest to opposing quarterbacks, but here's the real kicker. All the quarterbacks they've faced in that span are all currently top 12 overall fantasy quarterbacks. We got Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jordan Love, Josh Dobbs, all those guys inside the top 12 currently, and Denver been holding their own. Now, with all that being said and the already low ceiling on the road in Denver, I'm going to have to pass on DTR here this week, but what about Russell Wilson? I'd be lying if I wasn't worried about him as well. Dude has just turned into some dink and dunk type quarterback that doesn't throw the ball down the field until the game needs to be won late in the fourth quarter. It keeps his floor super safe because he's racking up completions, but the ceiling just continues to get lower and lower. In week 11, that was the first time he's had over 200 yards passing in a game since week 4. But he hasn't been playing bad football. Not at all. He's just going to remain one of those quarterbacks that's going to hover right around 14 to 17 fantasy points per game. But now he gets a matchup going up against Cleveland. They allow only 12.1 fantasy points per game. That is the lowest in the NFL. Part of me is a little bit torn here, though, when it comes to Russell Wilson. He is averaging at least 2 touchdowns a game all season against his toughest matchups this season, which makes no sense. Games against Kansas City, Buffalo, the Jets, even the Raiders, who have a very underrated defense. Russ is averaging over 2 touchdowns a game against all of those teams. And the fact that he's playing at home, there is nothing safe about starting Russell Wilson here this week. However, as a mid to high-end quarterback too, Russ could cook again. Which will now take us out to Las Vegas for the Raiders and the Kansas City Chiefs. And let's go ahead and just talk about Patrick Mahomes here at the start, because honestly, I don't know if you can ask him to do much more than what he did in week 11. His pass catchers let him down, plain and simple. Dropped passes all over the place, including a potential game-winning bomb to MVS Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and it absolutely killed the Chiefs. The drop at the end by MVS would have taken Patrick Mahomes from quarterback 15 overall all the way up to quarterback 5 overall on the week in fantasy football. It's crazy how one play like that at the end of the ball game can make such a big swing. But Travis Kelce didn't really help the cause either. Multiple drops and a fumble did not help out the Chiefs or Patrick Mahomes. This is just not what we're used to seeing in Kansas City with a Patrick Mahomes-led team. Plus, why the sudden overusage of Justin Watson? He also had multiple balls go through his hands, yet they kept going back to him over and over, and throw the ball to Rashee Rice more. He's way better and can do more after the catch. But now they get a matchup going up against Las Vegas. They allow only 15.3 fantasy points per game, an overall solid, underrated defense there in Las Vegas. You know you can't ever sit Patrick Mahomes. Nobody in fantasy football is going to do that. But this guy needs some big-time help on his team. They have now been shut out in Kansas City in the second half of ball games in 3 straight weeks. This makeshift wide receiver room that they've assembled there is an absolute embarrassment. You have one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, and you do nothing but surround him by a lot of hot garbage. Like I said, we know we can't sit Patrick Mahomes, but just know it's not due to just his bad play. His team is letting him down. All right, what about Aiden O'Connell in Las Vegas? And sure, the Raiders look like a better team here over the last couple of weeks, but not enough to make Aiden O'Connell a fantasy viable option each week. 3 touchdowns in 5 games and no rushing upside just isn't enough for us here. Now, don't get me wrong, it was great to see him actually air it out a little bit more in week 11. A career-high 41 pass attempts, a career-high 271 yards passing. But it also came with 3 interceptions, and if you're not going to throw a ton of touchdowns in this offense, you can't afford to have turnovers. Now a matchup going up against Kansas City, which is a very good defense. We saw it once again in week 11, really limiting the passing game of Jalen Hurts. They allow only 13 fantasy points per game. A super solid defense, like I said, and they're going to be looking to bounce back after that loss to Philadelphia. I love that this is a home game for the Raiders. It may make it a little bit interesting, but not enough upside there to start Aiden O'Connell. Which will then take us out to Philadelphia for the Eagles and the Bills, my Manscaped matchup of the week. Listen, don't be a procrastinator like me. Get your Christmas shopping done early. It's already Thanksgiving. Christmas is going to be here before you know it. Now, whether it's a family member in need or you want to buy yourself something, be sure to head over to manscaped.com and find yourself something great for Christmas, but don't pay full price. Whether you need a lawnmower, some shampoo, deodorant, boxer briefs, whatever it may be, they have you covered, but be sure to use referral code HEADLINERS at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. But let's go ahead and kick it off here in Buffalo first with Josh Allen, because it was great to see him bounce back in week 11, and he really did it without needing to use his legs on the ground, which is absolutely great. Now, Sure, 2 of his 3 touchdowns, really thanks to the pass catchers on those ones. Khalil Shakir and Ty Johnson made their touchdowns happen, but hey, fantasy points are fantasy points, and I will absolutely take them for Josh Allen. Now, of course, the interception streak continues, but if we're going to get 3 touchdowns a week, I'm sure people can live with the interceptions. Now a matchup going up against Philadelphia, they allow 18 fantasy points per contest, 9th most in the league. This secondary is still in shambles in Buffalo, and you have to expect in a game like this against a good offense in Philadelphia, Josh Allen going to have to throw the ball all 4 quarters to keep pace. Now, as of right now, he's the overall quarterback 1 in fantasy football, and in a matchup like this where he could thrive, through the air especially, he may just find himself atop my rankings here in week 12. But what about Jalen Hurts? He's about as must-start as they get as well, and he really said it best after the Monday Night Football game. They keep winning ball games, but they're not even playing their best football just yet. I mean, this week is a perfect example. The Eagles stroll into Arrowhead. They beat the Kansas City Chiefs, and Jalen Hurts had 0 passing touchdowns. It was his first game all year with 0 passing touchdowns. However, he still scored 20 fantasy points thanks to 2 rushing touchdowns once again here this past week. He just finds a way to always score fantasy points. His 19.9 fantasy points in week 11 was his lowest point total in a game since week 1. That is one hell of a floor each and every week. Now a matchup going up against Buffalo. They allow just over 14 fantasy points per game, 7th fewest in the league. However, we know that secondary is beat up in Buffalo, and if anyone can take advantage of that, it'll be Jalen Hurts. As of right now, he's the overall quarterback 2, and like I said, there is no way we're ever sitting Jalen Hurts. Which then takes us to Sunday Night Football, a matchup of the Baltimore Ravens and Los Angeles Chargers for Lamar Jackson. You could literally feel the sigh of relief from all Lamar Jackson fantasy owners after he put up another 20 fantasy point day in week 11. The 3 weeks prior to week 11, the Ravens hadn't really needed Lamar to do very much, so his point total was super low. But here's what's weird. In week 11, he really didn't do a whole lot more either. Only 26 pass attempts once again. It was the big plays in this game, though, that really put him over the top. He even lost out on a huge touchdown play to Zay Flowers that was called back due to a phantom penalty. But let's not just sit back and act like everything is great for Lamar Jackson, because it's not. He just lost Mark Andrews, and that sucks a big one. Now, word did come out here today that there's a small chance, that Mark Andrews actually could return before the end of the year. So that's something to pay attention to, but it's not going to help us out here in week 12. This matchup is great, though. Going up against the Chargers, they allow almost 21 fantasy points per game, 2nd most in the league. Something else to pay attention to here is the health of Odell Beckham Jr., who suffered a shoulder injury in week 11. Now, as of right now, he's just questionable, but that is definitely a player to pay attention to here as the week progresses. Now, when you see a matchup against the Chargers, that's one that we really want to exploit weekly. Their defensive secondary gives up points in bunches, but with no Mark Andrews and a banged-up Odell Beckham, this isn't the greatest chance for Lamar Jackson to have a huge ceiling game. But it's Thanksgiving weekend. I'm not trying to be greedy out here. I don't need a 30-point, I would love a 30-point game, but I'd take an 18-point game at this point. On average, he's been giving you right around 4 or 5 points a week just due to that rushing upside. If dude could just find the end zone one time on the ground this week, I have a feeling we're going to be super pumped about starting Lamar Jackson in week 12. What about his opponent, Justin Herbert? And Quentin Johnston dropped the ball on a huge fantasy day for Herbie, both figuratively and literally. However, he still had a super solid day, did Justin Herbert. 260 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, and a season high 73 rushing yards. His previous season high was only 27 yards, so that was a huge jump. Herbert has now had over 24 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games played, and he's the overall quarterback 3 in fantasy football. And don't be surprised if we see a little bit more of this team on my shoulders type play from him going forward. Dude is just losing weapons what feels like almost weekly, and the weapons he does have, like Quentin Johnston, aren't doing him many favors. But now he gets a crap matchup going up against Baltimore. They allow only 12.6 fantasy points per game. That is 3rd fewest in the NFL. We got guys like Jalen Guyton, Gerald Everett, Josh Palmer still. The list continues. The offense is banged up in LA. It's almost impossible to sit Justin Herbert, though. How do you sit a guy that has produced so much here this entire season? but this isn't going to be one of those ceiling type games. I love that it's a home game, and he's had 7 games this year in which he scored at least 20 fantasy points, but I don't know if that number moves to 8 after this week. Which only leaves us Monday Night Football, a match between the Chicago Bears and Minnesota Vikings for Chicago. How about getting Justin Fields back coming off an injury and then almost knocking off the Lions and rushing for over 100 yards on the ground? Now sure, almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, but still an overall solid day for Justin Fields. The passing game wasn't bad. 169 yards passing, 1 touchdown, no interceptions, but it's all about the 18 rushing attempts and over 100 yards rushing. That's the Justin Fields that absolutely dominates fantasy football. It's when the defenders are drawn in because of that rushing upside that really allows him to go over the top to the likes of DJ Moore, Cole Kmet, maybe even a little Darnell Mooney as well. Now he gets a matchup going up against Minnesota, and they allow 17 fantasy points per game. Now, if you remember right, it was week 6 against Minnesota that Justin Fields got injured, so you better believe he has a little bit of added motivation to put it to the Vikings here in week 12. It's just very promising to see 21 fantasy points in his first game back from injury in a game in which he didn't have to overly utilize his arm. Now, as for week 12, Justin Fields is going to be a Verge top 12 option for me here this week, and let's hope, just like Forrest Gump, he keeps on running. But what about his opponent, Josh Dobbs? Now, the magical win streak, it may have come to an end here in Minnesota, but the dude is playing such great football. He's the current quarterback 7 overall in fantasy, averaging 18 fantasy points per game, and in his 3 starts with Minnesota, hasn't scored less than 17.9 points in a game. One of the biggest reasons for his scoring this year, though, that a lot of people really aren't talking about, is not only the rushing upside, but the rushing touchdowns. He has had a rushing touchdown now in 5 straight games going back to his days in Arizona. Now a matchup going up against Chicago. They allow 18.1 fantasy points per game, right around what Josh Dobbs is averaging himself. That's 10th most in the league. What could really help out Dobbs here, though, that I have yet to mention, is the potential return of Justin Jefferson. Now, technically, he is still questionable, but this could be the week that they have him return. Minnesota is in must-win territory after that loss to Denver last week. People are still doubting Josh Dobbs every single week, but this Chicago team is a lot easier to throw on than they are to run on, and Josh Dobbs probably going to be a Verge top 12 guy for me this week as well. All right, that's going to do it for my quarterback start and sit video here for week 12 fantasy football. It's Thanksgiving week, and I'm hoping you have a chance to enjoy it. We're going to continue to do our best to get 9 videos out in 3 days so we all have the opportunity, ourselves included, to have some much needed family time. Now, in case you're wondering, all of our rankings will be out on Wednesday this week, just to be sure that you have all the information you need prior to the games on Thursday. I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day, though. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.